It began with a silence so complete it felt impossible. A jet that had been speaking to the world through steady signals, radio confirmations, and the predictable heartbeat of engines suddenly went mute. No distress call, no warning, no flicker on a radar screen to suggest struggle or failure. One moment it existed, slicing through the upper atmosphere, carrying passengers who believed they were safe in the arms of modern engineering, and the next moment, it was as if the sky had swallowed it whole. Commercial aviation had seen crashes before. It had seen storms, sabotage, structural collapse, even the violent unpredictability of early engineering. But never disappearance, never erasure. Jets did not simply vanish. Not in the era of radar and radio. Pilots did not go silent by accident. And aircraft weighing several tons did not melt into the horizon without leaving behind fire, smoke, or debris floating on the waves below. But this jet did. It vanished without a trace, and what it left behind was not wreckage, but fear. This is Black Box Files, where every story has wings, and every wing hides a secret. Subscribe. Stay with us until the end, and together we will reopen one of the most disturbing mysteries the sky has ever held. Today, we investigate the jet that vanished without a trace and left the world terrified. The flight had begun like any other. Passengers boarded under the dim glow of terminal lights, carrying luggage, books, newspapers, and quiet expectations of the journey ahead. Some were traveling home, others chasing new beginnings. In the cockpit, two experienced pilots prepared the aircraft with the practiced efficiency of men who had performed this ritual thousands of times. Engines hummed, oxygen masks were checked, fuel was measured, radios tuned, nothing was out of place. Taxiing from the gate, the jet rolled across the tarmac with confidence, a modern machine created to dominate the sky. Smooth, reliable, designed not to fail, that was the promise of commercial aviation. That was what passengers believed as they fastened their seatbelts and listened to the familiar cabin announcements. The wings flexed under the weight of takeoff speed. Engines roared, and in seconds the aircraft was airborne, climbing into a darkening sky. The early phase of the flight was uneventful. Controllers received routine altitude confirmations. Weather conditions were stable. The jet followed its assigned route across open waters, where countless flights had traveled safely before. There was no indication, no whisper of danger, no hint that anything was wrong. But, as the jet approached the midpoint of its journey, something subtle changed, a shift so small that no one on the ground noticed it at first. The radar return flickered, only for a moment. A tiny ghost of interference, a blip disappearing and returning again. It was the kind of anomaly controllers saw occasionally, usually a drift in altitude, a moment of turbulence, perhaps a radio static burst caused by weather. But this night held no storms, no electrical disturbances, no environmental threats. The sky was cold, clear, and calm, and yet, the jet's radar signature wavered again. Controllers attempted to reach the pilots. Routine call, routine response expected? Flight, do you copy? Silence? The controller frowned, repeated the call, adjusted the frequency, and tried again, still nothing. Pilots occasionally stepped away from communication for a few seconds, adjusting systems, speaking with the crew, dealing with minor cockpit tasks. But total silence, complete radio blackout, was never normal. And then, seconds later, the radar return was gone, vanished. The controller stared at the screen, waiting for the signal to bounce back. Sometimes radar reflections lagged. Sometimes a shift in the aircraft's angle temporarily created blind spots. But minutes passed, and no return appeared. A second controller leaned in, double-checking the equipment. Systems were tested. Frequencies reset. Backup screens activated. The jet was gone from all of them. It made no sense. The aircraft had been cruising smoothly at altitude. No distress call, no turn, no descent, no warning of mechanical failure, no sign of structural stress, no evidence of pilot error. It simply dissolved into the sky, leaving behind a void that swallowed not just metal and fuel, but entire families, hundreds of questions, and the fragile sense of safety people placed in aviation. The first assumption was equipment malfunction. Not on the plane, but on the ground. Controllers checked every cable, every relay, every antenna. They ran diagnostics on the radar array. They contacted nearby stations to ask if they could see the jet on their scopes. They reached out to aircraft flying in the vicinity, asking if anyone had visual contact. Every answer came back the same: nothing. The jet was invisible. Search and rescue teams were mobilized before dawn, dispatching aircraft, ships, and reconnaissance equipment into the region where the jet was last seen. They scanned the water, the sky, and the coastline for any sign: a floating cushion, an oil streak, an emergency beacon, a piece of fuselage glinting in the morning light. But the ocean remained undisturbed, smooth and indifferent, as if holding its secrets beneath the waves. Hours turned into a day turned into a week. And yet, there was no evidence, no debris field, no bodies, no life rafts, no oil slicks, nothing that could prove the aircraft had ever existed at all. To aviation experts, it was a nightmare scenario. When planes crash, they leave a signature, a scar on the earth, a trail of fragmented material. Even explosions produce identifiable remnants, but this disappearance defied logic. Investigators considered every possibility. Structural failure at altitude could theoretically tear an aircraft apart, but even then, the sky would rain fragments across miles of ocean. A mid-air fire would produce smoke and floating debris. Engine detachment would send parts tumbling. Rapid decompression would scatter oxygen masks and insulation. Yet none of these signs appeared. Even more disturbing was the fact that the jet had issued no mayday call. Modern aircraft are equipped with redundant communication systems. If one radio fails, another activates. If electrical power drops, battery backups take over. If the aircraft depressurizes, automatic alerts are triggered. If a fire spreads, sensors send alarms. If the plane begins to fall, pilots have multiple ways to transmit emergency signals. But this jet said nothing. It died in silence. International aviation authorities began digging through the aircraft's history, maintenance logs, inspection records, modifications, structural repairs, pilot experience, crew training, cargo manifest, flight path, weather conditions, radar logs, satellite data. They searched for anything abnormal, anything that might hint at what had happened. But nothing in the documentation explained the disappearance. The jet had been in excellent condition, the pilots were highly experienced, the crew well-trained, the weather calm, the flight path routine. Families gathered in crowded terminals, clutching photographs and hoping for news. Some prayed, some demanded answers, some refused to accept that a plane could simply vanish. They wanted truth, closure, something to anchor their grief. But investigators had little to offer. They could not even say with certainty whether the jet had crashed. All they had was a screen that went dark and a silence that stretched too long. Speculation exploded across the media. Some blamed catastrophic structural failure, a flaw deep within the aircraft's frame. Others suspected a cockpit fire so sudden that the crew could not react. Some proposed an explosion, though that would have produced debris. Theories multiplied: fuel tank detonation, hypoxia, instrumentation blackout, rogue wave impact, rare atmospheric phenomenon. But none aligned with the cold facts. No debris, no distress call, no trace. Governments faced pressure to respond. Aviation authorities issued statements urging calm, but privately, they were alarmed. A disappearing aircraft meant vulnerability, a hole in the safety net that modern aviation depended on. Ministers requested classified briefings. Military surveillance data was reviewed for anomalies. Satellites were checked for thermal flashes or object signatures. Every possible angle was examined, but the results were the same: nothing. The world had lost a jet in plain sight. For investigators, the disappearance became more than a mystery, it became an obsession. They reconstructed the flight from its first seconds. They studied cockpit checklists, altitude logs, maintenance histories. They analyzed the pilot's final confirmed words. They sifted through every scrap of radar retention data, amplifying signals, filtering noise, seeking patterns that could reveal what happened during those final moments before the plane slipped from the world's radar. But the record ended abruptly, as if someone had cut a reel of film mid-frame. One analyst described it best: it was like watching a heart monitor that suddenly flatlined, but without the patient ever showing signs of distress. As days turned to weeks, and weeks turned to months, the ocean kept its secrets. The jet remained missing, the passengers remained missing, the truth remained missing, but the story was not over. Because beneath the surface of the investigation, buried inside technical reports and guarded conversations, clues were beginning to emerge. Clues that hinted this disappearance was not random, not mechanical, not weather-related. Clues that suggested something had been wrong long before the jet ever took off. And when those clues would eventually surface, they would shake the world of aviation to its core. Because the jet that vanished without a trace may not have vanished by accident. The deeper investigators went into the disappearance, the more the case began to resemble a shadow, something visible only by the edges of what it left behind. Officially, they still called it a missing aircraft. Unofficially, many believed they were hunting something far more disturbing, an event that should not have been possible. As the weeks passed with no debris and no answers, the investigation turned inward, peeling back layers of the jet's history, construction, and operations. They needed to understand not just how it vanished, but why every trace of its final moments had been erased so completely. And that meant examining every moment leading up to the flight. The pilots had spotless records. Thousands of hours of flight time, commendations, praise from colleagues. They were not the kind of men who panicked, nor the kind who ignored protocols. Cockpit voice recordings were impossible to retrieve. The black box itself remained lost, but their last transmissions had been calm, professional, routine. Nothing in their voices hinted at distress. The cabin crew, too, were highly trained. Passengers on board included businessmen, families, students, and crew repositioning for future flights. No one stood out. No one carried anything unusual. At least, that was the official story. But investigators began noticing something unusual in the days before the flight, a string of minor anomalies during routine maintenance. A valve that had needed replacement twice in 1 month. A circuit breaker that had tripped unexpectedly. A navigation calibration that took longer than usual. None of these issues pointed directly to disaster. They were the kind of minor mechanical hiccups that large aircraft experienced often. But when placed together, in hindsight, they formed a pattern that made some investigators uneasy. Machines rarely break in dramatic ways without whispering first. Meanwhile, in conference rooms filled with blueprints and models, engineers pored over the aircraft's design. They studied structural diagrams, wiring charts, pressure bulkheads, and hydraulic systems. They examined older incidents in which jets had experienced electrical interference, sudden depressurization, or computer malfunctions. Some experts suggested the possibility of cascading failure, a sequence of small malfunctions that could rapidly overwhelm even the best-trained pilots. But that theory still failed to address the most crucial question: where was the debris? If the aircraft had broken apart at altitude, the ocean would have scattered its remains across hundreds of miles. Yet search teams found nothing. No floating seat cushions, no insulation, no composite material, not even a single panel drifting on the waves. The sea, vast as it was, did not behave like a bottomless void. When planes crashed, they left scars, oil streaks, fragments, pieces light enough to float for days or weeks. But here the surface was calm, undisturbed, as if the jet had never touched the water at all. Investigators considered the possibility that the jet had deviated from its route, perhaps due to pilot error or instrument malfunction. But the last confirmed radar position showed the aircraft precisely on course. There was no deviation, no last-minute turn, no attempt to descend or climb. The pilots had not tried to escape weather, avoid turbulence, or navigate around traffic. The jet's trajectory had been smooth, steady, and deliberate until it vanished. Intelligence agencies became involved quietly, without public acknowledgement. Disappearances of this nature, especially in geopolitically sensitive regions, raised suspicions of hijacking or interference. They reviewed satellite logs for unauthorized communications, analyzed foreign military radar sweeps, and scanned for any record of unidentified aircraft crossing controlled airspace that night. But nothing indicated intrusion. There were no military exercises in the region, no unusual radar returns, no unidentified signals. The sky had been empty, except for the jet that disappeared. As days stretched into weeks, tension among officials escalated. Families demanded answers governments could not provide. Airlines faced growing pressure from passengers afraid to fly. Aviation authorities scrambled to review procedures and reassure the public. Meanwhile, the media exploded with speculation. Television programs questioned the integrity of the aircraft model. Newspapers published theories ranging from mechanical failure to covert military involvement. Conspiracy forums argued about electromagnetic anomalies, secret weapons, even abduction scenarios that defied logic. People were not just frightened, they were fascinated, but real investigators had no room for fantasies. They worked through data methodically, searching for the crack in the armor of logic that would explain the impossible. And slowly, quietly, small details began to surface. Details buried deep in maintenance reports, details overlooked in early analysis, details that pointed towards something far more complex than a simple disappearance. One such detail was a note written by a technician 2 weeks before the flight. Power fluctuations in the auxiliary system. Recommend follow-up. There was no record of follow-up. Another note mentioned intermittent radio noise during taxi tests, noise that had been dismissed as environmental interference. A third report indicated that the aircraft's forward avionics bay had been accessed twice within 3 days, unusual frequency for a jet with no scheduled modifications. Investigators revisited the maintenance logs, interviewing the crew that had worked on the aircraft. Most recalled nothing unusual, but one technician, after hours of questioning, finally admitted something troubling. He had noticed a faint burning smell near the avionics panel a week before the flight. He reported it, but he never heard back. The panel was inspected, but no fault was found. The smell was too faint, too inconsistent, to be traced, and so the aircraft was cleared. Could an electrical malfunction have caused the aircraft's sudden disappearance? Possibly, but still the issue of debris remained. Electrical failures could bring down a plane, but they could not erase an aircraft from existence. The ocean still should have returned something, a single piece, a seatbelt, a piece of foam, anything. Then came a breakthrough, not from the ocean, not from radar, but from an unexpected source, a cargo manifest. Investigators discovered that among the standard containers of luggage and mail, one crate was listed simply as sensitive equipment, keep sealed, no description, no declared contents, no additional documentation. The crate had come from a private contractor known for working with high-security clients, including government agencies, and though the manifest identified its weight, the nature of the cargo remained classified. This discovery triggered a quiet storm within the investigative committee. Classified cargo was not unusual on commercial flights, but it was always documented, and it was always traceable. Yet the organization associated with this crate denied knowledge of what had been shipped. Their internal logs were incomplete, their representatives grew evasive when questioned. And the more investigators pressed, the clearer it became that someone did not want the truth exposed. Some investigators now believed that the disappearance may have been initiated, not accidental. That something on board failed catastrophically, in a way that destroyed the aircraft so completely and so fast that no distress signal could be sent. Others believed the plane may have been intercepted, diverted, or incapacitated by unknown force. But without evidence, these were theories, compelling, but unproven. And then, something changed. 47 days after the jet vanished, a small fishing vessel reported finding an object drifting in the ocean. An object that matched the material composition of the aircraft's outer skin. It was a panel no larger than a notebook, with edges twisted inward as if crushed from intense pressure. Chemical analysis confirmed it had been subjected to extreme heat, far more than what a standard fuel explosion or electrical fire would produce. The panel alone did not solve the mystery, but it finally proved one thing. The aircraft had suffered catastrophic failure. But where was the rest of it? If heat was involved, investigators needed to determine its source. Lightning, engine fire, fuel tank ignition, or electrical arcing could generate heat, but not enough to vaporize large sections of fuselage. Not enough to eliminate debris. Not enough to leave a void in the sea. This small panel raised more questions than it answered. Investigators quietly approached experts in rare atmospheric phenomena. They spoke with physicists about ball lightning, electrical vortexes, and electromagnetic interference events. Most experts dismissed these theories, but some admitted that the upper atmosphere could produce anomalies under specific conditions. Still, none could explain the absence of wreckage. Then investigators turned to military analysts specializing in high-energy weapons systems. Their response was even more troubling. They stated that certain classified technologies, still theoretical in public knowledge, could in theory produce total structural failure without fire or debris. But none would confirm whether such technologies were being tested in the region. By now, the investigation had reached a critical point. The truth was no longer a simple mechanical explanation. Something had interacted with the jet, something powerful enough to destroy it instantly, silently, and without trace. Whether this force came from within the aircraft or from the sky around it remained unknown. And the final clue, the one that would forever alter the direction of the investigation, would not come from ocean searches or data analysis. It would come from another aircraft. One flown by a pilot who saw something that night, something he could not explain, something that should not have been in the sky at all.